of what we were going to do today so that Darren and I could basically do the same thing. But I've got stories to tell that are different than his stories. Can you hear me back there all right? I don't want to yell. Now, one thing I want to impress upon you. We're talking about the history of Fairview in the early days, in the beginning, and the basic layout of the town at that time. So you got to use your imagination. There are only 2 or 3 things left that you can see, actually. The thing that I am really hung up on is the effect that the railroad had on Fairview. There is so much to be told about it, we don't have time to tell it. Every day I'm learning more and more about it. I get intrigued about the effect it had. And there were a lot of people that were influenced by the possibility of the railroad coming here to Fairview, Oklahoma. And it was something that was talked about in the Kansas City Star, in the Wichita Beacon. The Alva newspaper and the Enid newspaper spent a lot of time talking about the potential of Fairview because of the railroad. Now, as I've gone along and learned a lot of these things, I have also been influenced by the effect of the Mennonite community on the area. Those 2 things have been the building of what I call Lucky Fairview. And of course, in the history book and different places, they talk about the Bauer family founding Fairview. The Bauer family was the first of the people coming to Fairview, but they were just settlers. They happened to have a business mind, so they were instrumental in helping with the building as locals. But the railroad is the key to it. So we're going to start today at the Historical Society, looking at a couple of the monuments that still exist on the railroad. Now, first I want you to know is about Arthur Edward Stillwell. Arthur Stillwell was born in Rochester, New York. He was a member of a very well-to-do family. His grandfather, Hamlin, helped build the Erie Canal. Arthur was not a healthy boy. He went to school, but when he got through the 4th grade, he said, "This is enough for me." And I want you to remember, of all the things I'm telling you today, this boy went through 4 years of schooling. And at age 14, he left home. And he went to work in a place from Rochester, New York, clear to St. Louis, Missouri, where he worked in a billiard parlor as a cashier at age 16. And then he quit that job, and let's pull up just a little bit more and then stop. This is good right here. Arthur, I'm going to try to consolidate this. He was also a floor walker in a racket store. He liked to do printing, and his grandfather gave him $400, and he bought a little printing press and started printing. And he was just as industrious as a person could be without a formal education. He proceeded to go through the process of growing up, getting married, owned a horse and a cart, and rode it to Kansas City, Missouri, where he began his expansion of his idea for railroading. And he installed the interurban system for Kansas City, Missouri. He built 2 parks in Kansas City, Missouri. He was the backbone of a development through his Guarantee Trust Company. He had worked for Travelers Insurance Company and contrived a coupon-type endowment insurance policy and paid himself 50 cents on 1,000 and made enough money to buy stock in this Guarantee Trust Company, which he in turn used to buy the Kansas City Pacific Gulf Railroad, which runs from Missouri down to Shreveport, Louisiana. He said, I want a railroad that will go to the Gulf of Mexico. And in so doing, he developed the Kansas City Southern Railroad. The one characteristic he had that made him so unusual is he could talk you out of your money and never spend any of his money. He was known as a professional promoter with 4 years of education. He would contact people of high means and get them to invest in the railroad. Henry Ford invested in his project. He went to Henry Ford and told him, if you will bring your assembly plant to Kansas City, then you can ship cars by rail much easier and you can make more profit. Henry wrote him a check for $25,210.67 as an investment in the Kansas City Southern Railroad. I have no idea why that amount, but in any event, that was the fact that we find in the reports. And I'm going a lot to the Orient book, which was written and is at the library, that tells some of these things that I'm telling you now, other than the fact that Arthur Stilwell's biography is in numerous books and places. He was a fantastic man. He wrote 30 books with 4 years of education. He composed a hymn, The Prince of Galilee. The Prince of Galilee is a church hymn that he composed. He had visions. He claimed that he saw brownies. He would say that during the night, I got this vision to do a wonderful thing. Well, the Kansas City Southern was a successful railroad, but there are other entrepreneurs in the world at the same time. And so he started in 1898, and by 1900, he had been moved out of position in the control of the Kansas City Southern Railway. So he came back to Kansas City, and the businessmen, including the mayor and William T. Kemper, who was head of the, I believe, well, I can't think of the name of the bank right now, excuse me. But in any event, they had a banquet for him, and they toasted him. And then he was to get up and make a response. And he stood up, and he said, I'm not through. I'm going to build another railroad to the Gulf. And he said, I'm going to build it from Kansas City to Topolobampo, Mexico. And it will run down through the countryside, and it will promote all of these places along the way, and there will make commerce for Kansas City. And the mayor pulled out his checkbook, William T. Kemper pulled out his checkbook, and they wrote him checks to build a railroad. And what are you going to call it? The KCM&O, Kansas City, Missouri and Orient Railroad. And I'm naming it that so that I can go to the Gulf of Mexico and meet the ships from the Orient that are bringing produce and goods to the United States for transportation inland. He was also very good at meeting other people who were qualified in the railroad business. One of those was William Corridon Edwards, born in Tioga, Pennsylvania, of a family of 12 kids. and they were a farming family, but one boy went to school and got an education and came west in the run into Kansas and became the school principal for Larned, Kansas. Got sick, went to the, somehow, telegram or letter to William back in Pennsylvania and said, come and take over this school for me, I can't handle it. William came west with that in mind, and when he got west, he came to Larned, Kansas, and from there he became a member of the representatives of the state of Kansas. He later became the Secretary of State for the state of Kansas. William Corridon Edwards then was running for governor but failed. And so he began to look around, and he started a little bank, and then he bought into a railroad company. Now, that background gives you a reason for Arthur Stillwell spotting him in Kansas, over in Larned, to come with me and let's build this railroad to the Orient. So William, or W.C. Edwards, and a lot of those men then used to go by initials. I don't know why, but anyhow, W.C. we call him now. W.C. went with him to Oklahoma, and he began the land where, oh, I forgot to tell you, he became a lawyer while he was in Kansas. And so he learned a little bit about real estate. So he came down through this country and laid out the railway. And he was very good at taking a lease from you, or a right-of-way agreement, which was in fact a warranty deed. A warranty deed. So you'll find along here that Santa Fe Railroad, the successor to the Orient, owns minerals up and down by the highway out here. So Arthur Stillwell then went ahead, and the first stretch of land was up north of Caldwell, Kansas. They built it in stretches then. They didn't build the whole line starting from Kansas City. But they built that stretch, and then later they built the stretch on to the north. Came here in 1903. At that time, he borrowed an engine and 2 passenger cars and a caboose from the Missouri Pacific Railroad. That's all the equipment they had. By 1909, after coming to Fairview in 1903, he had 67 railroad engines lined up. And 19 of those 67 was the Brooks 280. You are looking at 2522 on the side of this one, which was actually number 66, the next to the last engine he bought for the KCM&O Railroad, which is a Brooks 280. For the railroaders' vernacular, the 280 means there's 2 little wheels in front, 8 big wheels in the middle, and none in the back. Now, the significance of that is these 19 engines proved to be the most efficient. He was constantly looking at ways to improve and to make money for the investors. And so this engine was a very successful engine. I find that there are only 5 of them in existence in the Midwest at the present time of record. This one, 2 in Kansas, 1 in Grand Junction, Colorado, and 1 over in Utah. It weighs 239,000 pounds. The significance of that is only that Stillwell felt like that a 60-pound ballast rail was strong enough to take care of the engines coming out of Kansas City. Well, in 1901 and 1903, they were littler engines. But as time went on and the bigger engines came out on the market, he ran into constant trouble and expense keeping the rails, the bridges, and the sidings in effect to support the engine. So he was running out of money by 1928, and that's when they sold out. Kemper took over as receiver, then they sold out to Santa Fe. The depot, 25 foot by 105 foot long, is an extra large depot. The standard is a little less than that. One of the problems they had, these people were telling about Fairview so much. Fairview was growing and there was so much interest in investors. I've looked at records at the courthouse at the deeds, and then those people would buy into Fairview and turn around and sell addresses from anywhere but this part of the country. I mean, they were non-resident investors, and they would buy on the promise that this place was going to grow. So W.C. Edwards comes into play much during the story. The thing that I wanted to point out then was the size of the depot. We had a banquet and moved it out here. One of the unique features is it still has the colored waiting room, which costs $56 to install. This hotel, the Bluefront Hotel, is one of my mysteries that I have not been able to solve. G.W. Steckel said in 1909 that he needed to borrow $300, and he borrowed $300 for this hotel. He sold it to Hofleger for $3,500. Hofleger sold his farm at Isabel for a like amount. And that's all I know about that Bluefront Hotel transaction. Except to tell you that we've got a picture in here which says Bluefront Hotel on the front, and it's not the same building. And G.W. Steckel also built a skating rink, which we'll go by the sites, and I'll point this out again to you later in the trip. And in the Fairview Republican, they went into great detail about the skating rink, and he borrowed $300 and built it. But they never talked about the Bluefront Hotel. And they did have an article in the Fairview Republican which said that a man came in and said, I'm going to build a 3-story hotel in Fairview to take care of all of this railroad business that is swooping in on the town. And that's the last we heard of it. I mean, we're talking about 1909 when John Floyd had already built a 3-story hotel, so that has nothing to do with it. This is a man saying he's going to build another 3-story hotel to take care of the railroad business, which nothing ever happened. I found in the Clio Chieftain much talk about the Bluefront Hotel. And I have the supposition, the opinion, and I'm proclaiming it, that the Bluefront Hotel was in Clio Springs and it was moved to Fairview, Oklahoma. You tell me how they got it down here, and I'll have my story complete. So let's go on now. We have 3 monuments here then that still exist that you can come and look at, 2 of which deal with the railroad. We're going to switch a little bit. Whew. So the drink stand up. I used to be in the wall. The settlement in the area is just full of intrigue. Bowers is the name that comes up immediately. There was Adam Bowers, who had 5 boys. 1 stayed up north. 4 of them came to this part of the country. V.S. Dillingham writes a story in 1929 about the coming to this area. V.S. Dillingham had a brother who homesteaded in Oklahoma Territory and told him about this country. VS came down from Delphos, Kansas and looked at it, went back, gathered all his friends and said, friends, this country is beautiful down there. Let's go down and stake a claim for a settlement. Now we're going to pull off right here and into the parking lot and swing back to see the stakes. So he lined up 2 wagon loads of people from Delphos, Kansas to come down and stake claims. Now, they got separated at Wichita, and one wagon went to Honeywell and the other one went to Caldwell. VS had on his wagon the oldest Bowers boy, Henry, and George Wright and William H. Cunningham. So we stop right here and look to the right. You see the flags I've posted there. These 6 men in their wagon got on the railroad that goes to Hennessy. And so they came down to Hennessy with their wagon, and then they got a pack horse and they came over to Okeene in preparation for the run on September the 16th, 1893. And when they got ready for the run, they decided that they would all just grab what they could. So they came on over. The pack horse came to the Cimarron River and saw that sand and started rolling in the sand, and they lost all of their cooking goods. Their beans that they had fixed and everything was gone. But they came on over, and when they scattered out, the ones that got here was George Wright, who's south just a mile, and his quarters in his wife's name. And then Henry Bauer got the southeast quarter of Section 28, which would be from Main Street west and north. Henry staked that quarter. William H. Cunningham staked this quarter. William H. was a single man. Henry was a single man. They then went to Alva with their stakes, and Henry took another stake on the northeast quarter of, the southeast quarter of Section 28, which would be where Jensen's is, that area there. They came up and met Clifford at Alva, and then Clifford staked his claim there. So the Clifford and Henry had the west half of Fairview. William H. was right here. That's September 93. In March of 94, W.E. Oxley from Cleo Springs went to Alva, and he got school districts organized based upon input from different people who were interested, one of whom was William H. Cunningham. So William H. got this district number 84 established in 1894, and this was his quarter of land from this roadway west to the west side of the Mennonite Church and north. This is the quarter here that J. Bartell owns this land now. He built a sod house right there. Now, the road wasn't there, so your corner of your quarter has got to be a little bit further out. I had to use my imagination. I would have guessed that he built back a little bit. But in any event, he built a sod house out of turf like we see right here in this parking lot, 25 foot by 50 foot long. Now, his brother, Hugh P. Cunningham, was a school teacher in Delphos, Kansas. And he brought Hugh down then in 1895, not 1894 like the history book says. He didn't get here until 1895 because he was still teaching in 1894 in Kansas. Came down, they had their first year of school. 58 students crammed into a space between those 4 flags right there. 58 kids. Someone said, well, why would you build a clear out here out of town? There was no town in 1894. There were 3 kids within the perimeter of what we call town. Charlie Floyd and the 2 Montague children, who were relatives. Why out here? The creek water was better than the water in town, which was dipping. And this creek water, of course, had to boil it. But if you look on the map, and I looked for the 58 kids, and some of them were so old they're already gone, but I found Martin's boys. Peter Martin settled up here a mile north. He had 4 boys in that school. The Eck family had 3 kids. The Buller family had 3 kids. There was a Nightingale. There was a Salaska, a Seibel. They were all strung out up and down here. And this school district over here was Headlight, which would be up north on the Blacktop Road up there towards where you go across to the water line. And Zimmerman's, Henry Peters, who lived right up the road there. They crossed the creek to get to this school rather than go up 3.5 miles north because it was closer. But that's the reason the school building was built right here. You wanted it. The school was supposed to be 3 miles apart, so kids would only walk 1.5 miles. Theoretically. There's a lot of things like creeks and fences, and when you get out west and see some of those gullies and canyons, you can't imagine a kid walking 1.5 miles through that stuff. But in any event, the object was to get close to where the population was. Now, 1894, that was fine. By 1897, we have a little change developing because the word was out about these railroad people building railroads. Well, by 1899, it was considered a possibility. And in 1900, it was coming to be fact. So you have an era right in there. Now, my good man, W.C. Edwards, was one of the 3 men that formed the Union Townsite Company. So in 1901, they produced the plat of Fairview and filed it of record, this is a picture of the original plat, and laid out the town of Fairview. Now we have lots and blocks, and immediately people started buying lots, one right after another. In this map, there are angled streets in the town. That was one of Arthur Stilwell's idiosyncrasies. He said an angled street, if you build on an angled street, you get more sunlight. So he put angled streets in as his 2 cents worth. But in any event, the point is, in relation to the schools, as soon as that plat was filed and people started buying, and they were coming in fast, these guys on the school board said, you know, we got to do something besides this. We can't keep bringing our kids out here. Now, in the history book, you'll find in the story of William H. Cunningham, who went on to be a successful citizen of the community, that his son Keith was born in that sod house. William wasn't married until 1902, and in 1904, Keith was born. So if Keith was born in that sod house sat there from 1894 to 1904, 10 years in use. I can tell you this for a fact, the Woodmen of America, which was an insurance company club or lodge, had their charter meeting in this schoolhouse in 1902. This was the meeting place for that charter because William H. was a member of the group, and he said, let's go out to my sod house. Now we can go on, Keith, and head on east or west. And so he built his house over north of the seat barn, which would be on the west side of this quarter. But this schoolhouse sat here for all that time. It troubles me to think about a sod building, just stacked dirt is all it is. They might be able to put some newspapers on the walls to hold the dirt out, but it was crude. So you can imagine what that was like, I'm sure. Now we jump from that era to a more current era because several people that were involved in the foundation meeting said that they heard rumors about different things. And right now you need to slow down because we're going to stop here at Darren's storage buildings. And that is the Rancho Dance Hall. William H. built right in here behind, right in there. He built a big frame house. Floyd Marshall bought a building from the Alva prisoner of war camp, brought it down here in 1946, and it became the Rancho Dance Hall. Teenagers could get in on Friday night. Wednesday night, Bill DeVort played. Saturday night was a guest speaker. It sat right here for several years. We had name bands. Johnny Lee Wills, brother of Bob Wills, came and played here at the Rancho. Ernie Fields, who was a black orchestra leader, he had a big orchestra in Harlem, New York, came and played at the Rancho for a dance in 1948. Merle Lindsay, who was at that time in Oklahoma City, came and played for a dance here. And he went on to California, got with CBS on the Ozark Jubilee, and recorded songs for MGM, and then retired back to Oklahoma where he died. Cece Davis, who was one of the leaders of our Fairview Municipal Band in early days, and later had his own band from Longdale, Oklahoma, came up and had dances here. And then there was this infamous Jazz Pups from Fairview High School. And we played out here one time. We knew 3 songs, and we played for a dance, and we played those 3 songs over and over. Floyd never invited us back. Okay, so now we can go on to...
What about the dance hall that was out west?
The Twin Cedars was on Highway 60 west of town. Raymond Wilcox built it a year earlier than this one. And his claim to fame was that he raised $60 for the Woodward tornado one night. $60. Yeah. Yeah, Raymond Wilcox put that in. Now, Darren bought this property, and I should hasten to remind him that he went up and checked with the people at Alva, and this particular building was the mess hall for the German prisoner of war camp that we had during World War II. Now we go right and left on 12th Street. We have another modern day land site that they wanted included, known as the Marinell Pickle Factory. We turn on Ash to the right. It was Nell. Bob Speece's wife was Mary. They couldn't find enough housework to do, so they said they wanted a job. So these guys got together and says, we will put in a pickle factory. So Hugh said, I've got this garage apartment, I'll convert it. Bob says, well, we've got this farm north of Cleo. Be the next street, but north of Cleo, we'll put cucumbers in. So he did. And they proceeded to buy vats. They had big wooden vats that they put in the backyard. They had wooden tubs they put upstairs. They converted this two-car garage right here. And there is the home, right up here, the two-story, the home of Marinelle Pickles. And the success depended on selling the pickles. Bob Speece was an undertaker, and he had people coming, bringing casket orders. And then Carroll was an investment business. He had people selling investments. So they loaded these guys down with pickles and made them sell pickles out of this garage apartment as they were going on their circuits. Now, your pickles were grown in the summertime. They had to wait for 4 months for completion. But in the fall, then these guys loaded up the pickles and went all over Oklahoma selling Marinelle pickles until the girls got tired of canning them and said, we want to go back to being housewives again. So we're off on our way. Now we go on over to State Road or somehow get to 6th Street. Yeah, I'd like for you to go back to State Road here if you would.
Do you know how long they sold pickles for? How long? Just like a couple of years?
Just about 2 years. Just a little less than 2 years, I think. Starting in the second summer was the last of it. My wife, she's a granddaughter, she said we used to go over and get into the gherkins. She said she's just sick of gherkins. She doesn't want to see another gherkin. They get into the gherkin barrel, she and her brother, and they just eat gherkin pickles. Are you all right back there? Yeah. Okay. If I put you to sleep? No. Well, I will. I go over to 6th Street, turn south on 6th and go a block and then go west. W.C. Edwards promoted Fairview wherever he went. He said that by 1910, we'll have 10,000 population in Fairview. And he went on to say that one thing Arthur Stillwell did was he made Fairview the division point on the railroad. Every 250 miles is a division point where you have repair shops and you have transfer of personnel and kind of make up the train to go on down the road. Fairview was a key spot for him, and this was what W.C. Edwards was looking at. W.C. Edwards bought this quarter of land, that quarter of land on the east side of town. I have 2 reports. One that he bought 8 quarters of land, and another one that he bought 9 quarters of land, all in speculation of the growth that would feed his purse. Say, stop here. With the Union Town site of 1901 being posted or filed of record and people buying lots, this growth brought the school board to think about a better school. They didn't have any money because we're still Woods County. Any tax money goes to Alva. We couldn't get tax money to do anything. John Floyd was one of the 4 men that staked these 4 quarters that are Fairview, Oklahoma. And John had a grocery store. And so John bought 2 lots right here and gave them to the school district. This is not the school building. I've had that asked before. This house was built in 1931. But there was, in fact, a 2-room frame schoolhouse right here on this lot, 601 North 6th Street. And so, with this expansion, because by 1902 we had 75 people, by 1904 we had 150 people. Several of these guys got married, they're having kids, it's starting to mushroom. And so we're seeing much of a growth in the number of children school age, and a lot of the adults that were coming back to school so they could learn to read and write, because a lot of them couldn't. Go straight across to the stockyard. So remember this little schoolhouse right here. So I would say that probably that building was completed in 1902. So 1902 we were through with the sod house and utilizing this building. 2 teachers were required. Arthur Stillwell said that in order for a town to grow, you've got to have industry. You've got to have reasons to have a railroad. So we go left here. This parking lot right here was the Orient Cotton Gin. The Orient Cotton Gin was a stream of cotton gins up and down through here that he had established in conjunction with the railroad. You say cotton? We had 10,000 acres of cotton in Major County right after he put the cotton gin in. We turn left here, and he also brought the Willis brothers in to build the Fairview Ice Plant. The Fairview Ice Plant is here on your left. Now then, if you will just stop right in here. Right here, stop. If you look out at those pickup beds, you'll see 2 pillars of concrete. There's 2 pillars of concrete sitting out there. Past the pickup beds. See the tire on top of one of them? And then on back, there's two chunks of concrete. That's the base for a Fairbanks Morse engine that operated a pump that pumped water into a huge building right here full of brine water. And in that brine water were metal containers of water on a crane that dropped down in. There were 200 of them. And that water circulating turned that water in the can into ice. They had a steam engine line that ran all the way back up to the cotton gin. So they operated the cotton gin and the ice plant on a 25-horse Fairbanks Morse steam engine. 200-pound cakes of ice. 200 pounds. That makes 400,000 pounds of ice per day that they produced out of this ice plant. They iced boxcars, they sold ice to Alene, to Canton. All of the towns up and down through here were serviced by this ice plant. There was also Allen's Creamery sitting right here that made Peerless ice cream. And so they furnished the coal system for that as well. And then right on the edge of this cooling tank, this tank was the cooling room where the ice was taken. We used to have watermelons stashed in there. Farmers would bring melons in and cool them and then sell them. We had a little place called the White Rock Cafe in Fairview. It was the only place in town that sold beer. They would bring their wooden kegs down here and cool them in this cooling room. My dad worked for the ice plant. My dad and Irvin Wickert and Hardwater Rothenberger, who was the delivery man, would take a 16-penny nail and tap into one of those kegs and take a syrup bucket and drain a little beer out of those kegs and then put a stick back in there, plugging it up, and White Rock never knew the difference. And Dad would bring home this little syrup can with a little beer in it. I thought that was milk.
I can't imagine your mother letting that happen.
I don't know that she knew about it. Let's go left here on Elm Street. It burned down in 1946, and you'll see pictures of a little ice house there on Main Street where Fairview Savings and Loan is.
Yeah.
And the Clinton Ice Plant stayed in business, and they brought ice up here. But for years, we had the #1 ice plant in northwest Oklahoma, right here. So we go on across the 6th Street and back around the block, okay? We're doing great. Have I raised any questions? Anybody got any questions?
Was the White Rock Cafe there for drugstores now?
White Rock Cafe.
What about it?
Where was the White Rock Cafe?
Right where Melissa Maynard's CPA store is there. That used to be the Farmer's Butcher's Bank. We'll get to it. I'll point it out when we get there. I just discovered this Friday. The Levings boys had it on one of their iPhones, and they showed it to me. I never knew it existed because it was built while I was gone in the 50s or early 60s, and I'm not sure which. But around the corner, we find a building that they call the roller rink. Let's see, it's on up. Yeah, another block on it. I'm sorry.
Go straight.
Yes, please. We've had several people ask about the roller rinks or the skating rinks, and I didn't know of any. For years, here, turn right here. For years we had a Chautauqua, and the Chautauqua would bring a skating rink in and set it up. But this is the building here that we found just Friday was the roller rink. The lettering was up there on those bolts right above. I don't know who built it. I'm going to have to go through all of the research because I just learned about it Friday. But this was a roller rink, so if anybody has that in mind about a skating rink, this is where it would have had to have been.
What time?
What is it?
I skated there, and Sandy Hirsch just found her skates. She's got them, but we skated there.
Could you tell us a year?
Well, it had to be 50s.
It had to be, didn't it?
Yeah, it was early 50s because
Early 50s, okay.
we graduated in 58, so it was before that. So,
I graduated in 48 and it wasn't here.
yeah.
So we got it nailed down that much, haven't we? Right?
Pick up there in 1951. Out of this building. 1950.
Did Champ, was it Champ? Did Champ build a roller rink?
I don't know.
We don't have that yet. I've got to track that down, folks. But I wanted to verify we did have a roller rink because that was on the list at the foundation. Now we go straight ahead. The only monument in existence today is a building on 9th Street in Kansas City, Missouri, called the Stilwell Building. Arthur Stillwell never saved any money. He had $1,000 when he died. Just sit there for a minute. He died as a result of an injury received in an elevator in a building and died in 1928. But I told you he wrote all these books. He had a wealth of knowledge with 4 years of education. We tried to give him a little honor by the Stilwell Hotel existed right here on this corner. It was a wooden structure 2 stories tall, and the porch extended out into about that where that car is, into the lane, because at the time they built it, there was no street here. It was just a little path for buggies and horses. This building here, Dr. Lindley came to Fairview and he put in a drugstore over on the other side until he could build this building. His wife wanted to be able to watch the horses and buggies in the street, So there was a porch that wrapped around so she could sit out on the porch. She was the pharmacist and he was the doctor. Their son was Howard Lindley, who went on to the House of Representatives. But they built this building, and the Stilwell Hotel existed on this corner then until 1928. Raymond Woods bought this property and he sold the hotel off. Now, 4 Martin's boys, I said, went to school in that sod schoolhouse. One of the grandsons moved that hotel. We find a lot of wooden buildings that were shuffled around. People would buy a lot and then they'd buy somebody's building and move it over. A lot of them were 12 by 12, an easy measurement for a carpenter, right? 12 foot by 12 foot. Easy to do, easy to move. Homer Deemer, who lived east of town, was a house mover too. He told about moving the town of Isabel when the railroad came through a mile over and they had to move the whole town to get close to the railroad. They cut cottonwood trees and made cottonwood rollers and rolled buildings on pieces of cottonwood. There was no resistance to moving buildings. So Davy Martin moved this big building. I don't know where it went, but he jacked that sucker up and it went clear back past where it went back to the end of this solid structure that Raymond later built. Now, wait a minute, let's wait and let him pull away. When he pulls away, you pull in there. You can see across the way the eagle. Can you see the eagle up there on the building?
This corner,
Right up on top of the building, across the street.
this blue one, the blue building.
Can you see it? W.C. Edwards, who bought all this land around town, also bought several lots on this block on both sides of the street. He bought 2 halfway up. He bought these 2 here and put them in his wife Frances' name. This was in 1908, and in the 1913 he built the building. In 1920 it became a post office. Why was he interested in post offices? W.C. Edwards became the postmaster for Wichita, Kansas. And so he had an in, and he got that established to be the post office. Now, I cannot say that bird was put on there at that time, because I have found a picture that looks like, from the cars in the street, that it was earlier and there was no bird up there. Why does the name Herb Cleaver come to my mind when I see that bird? He either put it up there or fixed it, one or the other. He had something to do with it. What? He repaired it. Okay. Okay, it had one wing broken off and it was repaired. Okay, Herb did that. Okay. We don't have any record of it being installed. But the building had a room some 25 foot in the front. Now, we're not talking about the north half. We're talking about the inside half of the big building was the post office. And that was a newsstand. They called it a cigar stand. This side over here sat vacant, and then Sutter, old man Sutter, put in a feed store there. But in this block here, this was not the first block expanded. The one down block was. But this block had 7 structures on it in 1903. Starting with the far corner was a bank, and about where the other truck is was a second bank. And then this Lindley family had the 3rd structure. On this side of the street, there was nothing, but down at the end, where the kid gift shop is, Wellington Brown built a 2-story building. He came in 1902 and put in a wooden frame building, and at that time, he got the post office from Bowers. Bowers was our first postmaster. Brown got the post office. Next to him was a store owned by J.J. Neufeld and John Classen. And it was a general merchandise store. And then there was nothing except right in here someplace was a little 12 by 12 that Ira Day has a barber shop. And I've got a book of which I kind of keep track of the movement thing. Ira Day was over there. It wasn't long till Ira Day was over on this side. Then Ira Day was around the corner. Then Ira Day was down there. They just dragged that 12 by 12 all over downtown Fairview. Ira Day would go from place to place. I thought, in any event, W.C. Edwards bought where the printing shop is now. And then he persuaded Neufeld and a guy by the name of George Ward to build buildings out of brick. So in 1908, those buildings there were built. This building here was the first one built, and I don't know who built it. This one in the white. But right after that, they built these buildings. They are separate buildings. But WC said, let's put a front on them, a common front. So we got a common front, and up at the top it says, whoops, Union. Where am I? It says Union Block for some reason. Union being the name of the townside company that laid out Fairview. Those guys were just scurrying around doing so much. There are deeds that are written and signed by the Mutual Townside Company. They had so many companies, they got them wrong. One deed was made to Harry Bauer. Not Henry Bauer, Harry Bauer. They just were scrambling around writing deeds and doing things. WC bought those lots. He got that all put together, but they named it Union Block, and it's up there on the side, 1908. F.H. Murray built the next building then. Lindley then moved over here. Now, you see the building with the H on it? This gray building here was the First American Legion building, First American Legion Hall. And it was, this area here was built by J.L. Admire. And J.L. Admire came from Kingfisher and put in the Lions clothing store. And it existed until W.C. Edwards got him appointed postmaster of this post office over here. This H stands for Hargrave. Jack Hargrave built that building and put that H up there. That's an emblem of his name. And he was the commander of the American Legion and sold the lot that the Legion was in, and that's his only connection, is he was involved with the Legion. But where it says Summit Land Company right there, we've got fire on our mind today because of Jensen's. That was the first Jensen Implement Company right there. Jensen Case Implement Company in 1936. Right here, boom, was the bank number 2. This was bank number 1, and it was formed as the Carroll Bank. Carroll was the daughter of W.C. Edwards, whom he thought the world of. So we're going to name the bank the Carroll Bank, and we're going to change the name of this town to Carroll. Carroll, Oklahoma. Well, it didn't fly. And H. Clay Willis got rid of Carroll and made that the Bank of Fairview. Bank of Fairview was the first bank. I wrote the script, I had it backwards. This bank here was formed by some other guys and it was the first national bank. And then it became the first state bank. And then they combined them. And in 1912, D.M. Crest built that building where Weimer Brownlee is down on the end. And they put in the Citizens Bank. And then they incorporated that with Fairview State Bank, and it all became Fairview State Bank. And this little bank building was moved from Rusk. It was the Bank of Rusk at one time. And after they merged to become Fairview State Bank, and Roy Abernathy had come to Fairview, he bought that lot. And then we're going to turn left here at the light and stop.
Question. What upstairs building did Dr. Bond have an office?
Right, back at the back.
Where the H is?
Yeah. Yeah, we're coming to Dr. Bond. Okay, so you have 4 settlers in the run of 1893. You had Henry Bower, Clifford Bower, John Floyd, and a Becker, whose initials escape me, south where Baker Ford is, down that way. Your center point is Central in Maine, not Broadway in Maine. I can't figure out why they moved it. Homer Deemer, in his journal, well, Miles wrote the journal about his dad, Homer, saying that Homer said that Main Street ran east and west, but they came over with their moving equipment and turned it and moved it to north and south. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I do know that Clifford bought the lots here on the corner first and then conveyed them to Henry after 1901 for some reason. Your 4 Martin's boys were all industrious. Peter put in a machine shop. Henry put in a shop to the south, but I don't know what happened, because when he sold it, his address was Hillsboro, Kansas. He may have gone away to school or through the church for some reason. He's gone. But in any event, Peter then sold to younger brother Dan a steam engine, and they took the dray equipment that had been pulled by horses and started working these 2 streets here to make wider streets. They went to the railroad and got their surveyors to do the surveying and lay out these bigger streets. John Floyd then was actually in a dugout at the far end of the block with a little grocery store, which was nothing but a wooden box with a few things in it. He'd carry it in the house at night. But in any event, he got enough money that he built his hotel here on the end. And then he put in his grocery store there, and he expanded and was quite involved. Right here is where the White Rock Cafe was, by the alley. Dr. B.F. Johnson came down at the request of M.M. Smith, Malcolm Smith's dad, put his place in right there. And if we could stop right here in the shade.
Yeah, that's good.
1902, 1902, D.R. Thomas built that building on the corner that was a wood frame building, and it was the Opera House on the 2nd floor. They called it Thomas Hall. The Opera House was a full room on the 2nd floor, and the 1st floor was a buggies and hardware store. It was used for many purposes. The Christian church had their first service there. The high school had their first graduation there. And I'm going to get to the schools later. School was held here. Some of the classes held school here. D.R. Thomas was not interested so much in the culture, but his wife was an opera fan. They had a show and the place was packed full. Fire started at Newfield's store, and Wellington Brown's building went up in smoke. D.R. got a little bit scared. He looked and he didn't have a fire escape. So he had to go to effort to make that building a little bit safer, but it didn't work out. He put in a tin background at the stage, and he did several other things. The fire department was right there on the corner, the one little lot. It wasn't even 12 by 12. It was just big enough to hold a wagon that would be pulled by 2 horses. The livery barn was behind these buildings in the other half a block. They found out that when they went to get the horses and get them up here and hook them up to the wagon, it was too late. So they contrived the idea of having a bunch of guys run. So they had a 10-man fire team, and one guy was the fire chief. D.R. Thomas was the lead on the wagon. We had a salesman come to Fairview and said, "You've got a water tank, what you need is chemicals to put out fires." And they said, "Okay, what are we going to do?" He said, "Let's build a fire and I'll show you how my chemicals work." A bunch of guys overheard it. They said, let's fool them. So they went over on the west of the tracks and piled up some rubbish. Built this fire down by the flour mill, sounded the alarm, the 10 guys ran out and got the wagon and started down the street. Now this was just a dirt street, and it had a lot of mud in it because that was the town water well. There was a lot of water being scattered. D.R. Thomas fell flat in the mud. The wagon went on with 9 men. They put out the fire, and meanwhile these guys set this other fire over there. And the chemical man said, "There's enough chemicals to do it too." So they went over and put that fire out. And they said, "My, we got to buy one of those." So he lucked out and put out 2 fires with only 1 intent. D.R. Thomas then rented this building as the city hall. Our city council met in 1903, before there was a town of Fairview or a county of Major. They met in the little bank. They had no money. The bank had some paper and a pencil, and that's how they kept a record of what was going on. They had to borrow $300 before it was over with. But in time, in a matter of months, they set up the city hall in the Opera House. Now, come 1907, you have a county. Major County was now in existence. They had no courthouse. Where can we go? They went to the D.R. Thomas. Court was held on the stage of the Opera House. And the city charged the county rent. The county didn't have any money because it was all in Woods County, and Woods County was fighting against the severance of the counties and would not release the money. They got behind in their bill. And Fairview almost had to sue Major County to get their rent money because they were paying D.R. Thomas rent. But D.R. Thomas finally went to his friend that had the Lions clothing store, and J.L. Edmeyer agreed to buy some lots and build a courthouse. And so, not a courthouse, a city hall. So we go forward, and the city hall was built on the vacant grass right here, and all of the city officers then came here, and they rented the building to the county. We had a jail back behind, and then we later built a firehouse. This building was built in 1939 with government labor. WPA, yeah, I couldn't get the company. I want to hasten to add that this brick building is not the Thomas building. The Thomas building was torn down, and when the Cornelsons built the hotel, they put in this building. They did not build a tunnel across the street. The rumor is that there's a tunnel under there for Dick to haul his whiskey. That is not true, because the city has verified that ground was solid. It's never been tunnelized. Okay, now we go straight ahead because you're a Mennonite community with several churches. I forgot. I'm not sure what year. I want to say 1902, but I'm not sure. But they came together. M.M. Just was one of the key ministers out here in the South Mennonite Church. He was the spokesperson for the group. They came into the city council and they said, we have $1,000 that we will put on the table if you will put up $1,000 and build a hospital for this community. Fairview couldn't do it. The lobbyists took over. We had 5 doctors in town at that time. A doctor's office would have the front office, then they would have a pharmacy, and then they'd have a place for a bed where you could lay down if you were sick after you took your pill or something like that. They had it all, don't you see? And they didn't need a hospital. They could take care of it themselves. So with their persuasion and the lack of money, we did not get a hospital until 1946 when Robert Bryan came to Fairview, and this building was built as our first hospital on that vacant lot. A 2-story rectangular building. The emergency room was in the back. I remember because I fell out of the back end of a pickup and they brought me in, and I can remember that doctor in that room. And then the lobby was at this front end. Now, I got a report just recently that also there was a nursery room in the northeast corner. And in 1947, we had 2 births and 5 dismissals out of that little hospital. Now, I forget what year, it slips me now, but it wasn't but just a few years later that Dr. Don Smith, brother of Malcolm Smith, came back to Fairview, a prisoner of war victim who came back to practice law. And he bought the hospital from Ryan. Then H.B. Bond came in with him and established the hospital there until Dr. Smith died for some reason. I've heard suicide. I don't know. You may know. It doesn't.
Real big feet, for doing surgery during the war. This is what my mom told me. He was in so much pain with his feet that he got drugs.
There you are. Yeah, I knew it was something like that. But in any event, when he stepped down, Bond hooked up with Weir, and they went up to where the Goodyear tire place is on North Main and started a clinic up there. Somehow Weir came down here to the next block, which was originally the Presbyterian Church, and they put in a clinic there, which he connected with Belter, and they sold it to Belter and K, and this became the Belter K Clinic. And HB went back up on Main Street and opened up his place there on North Main on the east side by where, but that foundation there was right. Our little school over there that we talked about in 1905, just 4 years after we got the plant and bought the 2 lots over there, they started building. Bass Construction Company out of Enid, Oklahoma got the high bid and built a 2-story brick schoolhouse right out there in that lot for $5,600. It had a cistern, it had electricity, it had toilets. A half a block east was the toilets. A half a block east is over on 9th Street. But it was the half of a total building to start with. was not enough room for all the schools. 2 grades went to 601 North 6th. 2 grades went to the Opera House. We have a skating rink we're going to come to later, a skating rink location. Some of the grades went to that skating rink. They had to spread all of those classes out in order to manage till they get the building built. They agreed to build it for $5,600, but they couldn't get any brick. So it was 2 years in the building to get this building built. Now, growth being what it was, all of this developed into the need for a bigger high school. So in the 20s, we started the Red Brick High School. 1936 was my first year of school. That building was all but 2 rooms complete. First and second grade went to school in the Presbyterian basement. That's where I started school, in the Presbyterian basement. So in 37 then, the building was completed. And this building was torn down, and we go forward now and turn right. And this house was built with brick from that school building. That's Dr. McCroskey's house, was built with that brick. So you see, it was a good brick, and they had trouble getting it here. Now very slowly, stop. There was so much potential, so much expectation in Fairview. And the work was coming in at the railroad yards. We had 130 men working in the shops. We had 50 men on the tracks out on the road beds, and plus your depot. We could not keep up with the Western Union telegrams coming in. In 1909, the railroad said to the town of Fairview, "You haven't got enough houses in this town. Our boys are staying in these little rooms up over the buildings, and they can't get their families here. They have to leave. It costs to leave." Railroad ticket to Wichita was $5. They couldn't afford it. Build us some houses. So the city got with Kersey, Goodwin, and George Keck, and they agreed to contract to build houses. So all of these houses, from this blue house over to Main Street, were houses built for the railroad, for families to come and live with the railroad workers. This was Hooten, an engineer, this first one, and so his was a bigger house. Remember him? Boomer Hooten, Davy Hooten? Yeah, okay. Now then, some of the houses have been replaced now.
Sherry Floyd lived in that house, and Mrs. Floyd. The first
That one there?
Yes, that was Sherry Floyd's house. She was my second grade teacher.
I thought that was Charlie Slack's house.
That blue one was Sherry Floyd's. I think. I'm pretty sure because I've been there. They used to come to our place at the farm.
See, some of the units have been replaced. That's a new house there. But in any event, on the right on the corner was Pete Jones Veterinarian.
There was a creamery right over there.
The Legion Hall was built, this building was built in 1947. The first one was built in 1924. Now pull over here and stop. If you look at the back of the Wittenbaker Ford, you see an unusual line for that wall. That was the Lyric Theater. It was built by Peter Hebert, who bought the lot from Cornelius Gertz on the corner, and he built the theater and then sold it to a guy named Cronkite. So at that time, we had 2 full-scale movie houses in Fairview. And it existed for a number of years, but they didn't advertise much in the Republican like the Royal did. The Royal would advertise every week. Once in a while they'd have an event and they'd run an ad for it. It was available for community functions, so it was quite usable. Ron Reams talks about going in when they first took it over as Reams Motor Company, and he was just a boy working in parts, but he could see the ceiling and he could see the floor, how it was sloped, and then they repaired it to make it usable for something like this. But in any event, it was built to be a movie theater because that was a phenomenon. Your first movie was about 1908 in the Opera House, but it was just a little flicker type thing, and it wasn't really a movie. The Odeon Theatre, which was up where Ootsy's is, was an actual movie theater and bathhouse. A bathhouse that charged $2 a year for all the baths you wanted to take all year long. You could sit in that bathtub all year for $2. They had a concession stand on the sidewalk, and the town of Fairview said that is an obstruction. It's got to be removed. The city council was very strict about making this a clean, nice little town. Roller skating was prohibited on the sidewalk. Spinning of tops was prohibited on the sidewalk. All dead carcasses had to be buried. Cars on Main Street had to have mufflers on them. It got so bad when they got 9 cars in Fairview, they redid the zoning so you could not park a horse and buggy on Main Street or Broadway. You had to come off on a side street, and there were hitching posts and feed bumps along these side streets for your teams and buggies because those 9 cars were causing the horses and stuff. And here's Mrs. Lindley sitting up here on her second floor. She can't stand to have those horses and buggies going wild. We're going straight ahead now and pull over where that other bus is and stop.
When Gary just had to only jackhammer, he put the hydraulic lifts in.
He did? Who?
Gary Just.
He did?
And
Okay.
broke through the first floor and then hit the slant floor underneath of the theater.
There you are.
They had to hammer drill through 2 floors to put the hydraulic.
Now that's interesting to
Yeah,
know.
that was in the 60s, late 60s.
Well, that's had a wonderful history. So many things have been used. This was a service station right here with the drive-through
Yes.
driveway in there. And now right here, see this corner is your corner sections right here. Floyd, Bauer, Buller, Becker. There was a building right here that we were talking about Friday across to the south, and it was the Mr. Bays put it in first. Across the way was the building that Peter Martin's installed, which would be the south half of the Baker Ford place there, was our first Ford dealership. I cannot nail down the year, but in the history book we have pictures of cars, and I've been studying them. They've got to be a Model T. Model T came out 1908 as a 1909 car, and it hit the streets in 1908, but the dealership didn't start until after that. But somewhere between 1909 and 1911, the Ford dealership was started by Peter Martin, who had sold his steam engine to Dan Martin to do his streets. Now Peter got his money building that road that goes in front of the sod schoolhouse out to Rusk. That's where he got his start, was building that road. Put in his Ford dealership here. This was Baser.
Pete lived in the back and Davey was born in the back.
Yeah, Pete lived in the back of the building. We got a picture of him after they got married. They lived in that building. And right here is your first structure of Fairview. This is the building that Clifford and Adam built out of logs, a picket log house. And it was our first post office. When they got it built, they filed in '94 to have a post office, and they wanted to name it Bowerville. And the government says, we don't like that. So they said, and the book says that Adam looked out and said, oh, we have a Fairview, we'll call it Fairview. That's not the way the other story goes. He said just Fairview. So they put it Fairview. Now, this house, there's a picture of it in the Fairview Republican. Dick Cornelson bought it, remodeled it, covered the outside of it. and it was over there where Kevin Ewald's house is. And when they took it off, they took a picture of it, and Art Bauer and Bruce are standing in front of the building. They peeled it back, and you can see the picket logs that it was built with. A very good structure. This building here was one of Arthur Stilwell's pet deals. He bought these lots all the way from the alley over and put this in as the Anthony Wholesale Company, the Anthony Distributing Company. The brand name was Green Parrot Canned Goods, and it came out of Kansas. And then he sold out after the other stuff happened. Over here, Mike Howland came from Sharon, Oklahoma in the 30s, put in his little creamery business right here on the corner, expanded it to poultry, expanded it to turkey. Fairview became the turkey capital of the Northwest or Oklahoma or the nation, depending on who you talk to. And sold turkeys up through World War II. I was in Korea and saw an egg crate that said Fairview Produce on the side of it. Yeah, and enjoy. We don't move Korea. So it was quite an expansive operation, and then they would sell turkeys back east, and the railroad cars would park here, and we packed them with ice on both ends, and they put the turkeys in the middle, and they hauled them to the market. Now, if we could go on west real quick. Right. Is everybody asleep now? If you're not, well, here's some more. When Fairview developed, we didn't have water on the west side, certainly no sewer. Around the block to the right. So this part of town did not develop good. There's a lot of these lots sold for taxes. A lot of them. Few houses developed. I grew up over here, so I know quite a bit about it. We couldn't afford to live on the east side of town. We had to live west of the tracks.
In here it talks about the West Side School. What's that?
We're coming to it.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Okay.
Turn right.
When did Howard's close and why?
1952, Mike just ran out of steam, and the boys weren't interested in it.
It's later than that.
Yeah, my dad worked there for 56.
What is it?
I remember them hauling
Ooh.
chickens and turkeys in there
Oh yeah.
in the 60s.
All right here. Because of the railroad, the trains going up and down, the school board was fearful that these kids on the west side might get in trouble. They got the railroad to put up flag men at Central and Broadway to flag so the kids could go to school. And they said it'd be cheaper if we help you build a schoolhouse. So they built a 2-room schoolhouse right here. And grades 1 through 4 went to this school, so they didn't have to cross the tracks. The trains weren't going real fast, but what's happening, your depot that we're coming to, we had so much produce come into that depot, the trains would park and stop on the streets. We kids knew that because we used to crawl through. I can remember crawling through the train to go to school. That's the kind of thing they didn't want to happen. But I lived north several blocks, and so we didn't get the courtesy of coming over here. Okay.
So when did this school close?
I've got notes of it up to 1912. 1912 comes to my mind right now, and it wasn't much after that. But they did, I think, bring a class or two over here because of that problem with the big school building. Now, when the settlers came, broom corn was the big thing. Not wheat, not cotton, but broom corn. And right up here, where he stopped, were broom corn factories, broom corn warehouses, all up and down along the tracks. Your depot set right where that building is right there. Now down there where I said the Bay's building was, and the old cabin, the first cabin that was built, that block was the first block where any buildings were located. Mr. Hubble came in from the farm and built a hotel, the Hobo Hotel. Well, when the train came in 1903 in August and stopped right here, they took a picture, and you can see a picture of the hotel sitting right there in that parking lot. And at that time, it was called the Orient Hotel. Hubble sold it, and the Orient Hotel was put in there. Smith Crane Creamery was the first little building here on the right. There was a eating house north of the depot, and I can't find any description of it. Arthur Stillwell was going to bring the Hardy House here, which was a very prominent following of the Santa Fe system. And they have pictures and they have the floor plan and everything, but it didn't get built for reasons I'll come to later. But anyhow, the man with the moving equipment went out to Rusk, bought 2 wooden buildings because Rusk was just completely sold off. Specs just sold all that stuff off. 2 buildings were there. Where that car is was a bowling alley. Right there. The hotel sat here. Then there was a bowling alley. And then where that dump can is was at one time a pool hall. Ira Day used it for a barber shop for a while. It was also Klassen's shoe shop. Now your bank building, it wasn't, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 windows past that door. Probably the first 3 windows is all the bank building was. There was gaps in between these buildings. And over here we had a gap, and then Smith bought out Crane, I believe, and joined with Rathburn. But in any event, his son, Uri, graduated from Fairview High School, got his diploma to teach, taught Sharon Valley at Oriental for several years, came here and put in Smith Poultry. Now we've got Smith Creamery and Smith Poultry, father-son. They expanded and then all that block became the Smith. And Uri took it over from his dad, and we had the same kind of operation here that Halloran had. So for a long time we had 2 major produce producing companies. This building then, after the cyclone of 1937 tore up the back side of the building, Walt Wise took this building and put in a feed store here. So you remember that? Yeah. But then Uri went into the oil and gas lease business, and that was the end of that. This block is full of different little buildings that became cafes, donut shops, bakeries, toggeries, and this was a leader printing shop here, and then we had the Republican in here somewhere at one time. It was just a maze of little stores that has me totally confused. We're going to go south and wind down. Now your Floyd Hotel was right there. Marvin found the flag in there. It's got 48 stars on it. He's just having a fit. He wants to make that. He wants to make a thing for it out of his shop. And he wants me to do the story of the 48 star flag. Henry Bauer bought the first 3 lots. The next lot was vacant. Dr. M.M. Smith, when he came to Fairview, was in a tent, put in a little store down here by where James Jensen's burned up. Then he bought this lot here after the town was platted to put in his drugstore. The north half of what was Smith Drugstore was a vacant lot. And in the newspaper in 1909, it talks about the new air dome. And it says that Fairview will have, something like a lot of amusement on the west side of Main Street. And I didn't know what that was, so I kept reading. Later that same year, 1909, an oily rag caught on fire and started a fire in that building. It went up on the roof of the next building, which at that time was Parks Jewelry, and burned the roof over there. So what this was, at 1,500 square foot, 1,500 foot of film was burned. So as I kept reading and I found the fire maps of 1910 showed a stage. What this was an open theater, so it was movie theater number 3 that was being installed in Fairview as an open air with a stage at the back. But the film burned up, so it became a dead horse, and M.M. Smith bought that lot and expanded the Smith Drug. Now, Henry owned the lots, but he sold it to Farmers and Merchants Bank because he owned an interest in it. They started in 1910 over where Kid Drug is. Then they bought this lot from Henry, who also was a member of the bank board. Henry owned the third lot, and when they started building this building, he said, I make the stipulation that you make ties on that wall, and we'll have a community wall so I can tie in. So they built that wall with protrusions of metal or something, and all those trusses for that building are hanging on that building over there. They made a big deal of that contract to do that. So those two buildings are going to be together. And I was trying to get all of this in my mind. This little lady walked out and wanted to know what I was doing out here on the sidewalk. She sells, looks like cannabis. And I told her what I was doing. I went through all of this. She said, do you know this was a brothel? I said, what? Yeah, there's a brothel. She said, there's a little room back there with a bed. This was Dr. Smith's office. And as I told you, these doctors had drugstores, and then they would have a place. If you were sick, you could go lay down. That's all it was. There was never a brothel in Fairview, Oklahoma. Evelyn Dow's book, bless her heart, she did a lot of writing and recording of things. But she had it in her mind about the saloons in Fairview. There was never a saloon in Fairview because the city council went to great effort to gerrymander the districts of the town for council members to come from, and they would be getting council members who were against saloons, so that there would never be a saloon. There wouldn't be anybody that could approve a saloon. So there was never a saloon. There was only the White Rock and now the Corner Bar, which we all are familiar with. But the Ku Klux Klan came through here in the late 20s from Enid or Oklahoma City, a long caravan of cars, and they had banners, and they said, get rid of the saloons, get rid of the prostitutes, and all that. They marched into the Christian church, put some money up on the stage as a donation, walked out the door without saying anything, went over to the Methodist church and did the same thing. Got back in their cars and they went up to Nichols Hills and had a big bonfire up there. That's in the Fairview Republican, that story. But they must have just assumed, because that's the only reference I've found in any of the Republicans to anything about any illegal conducts. Now, there were a few illegal conducts. Our first jail, we arrested 3 men from east of town for bootlegging. And they brought them to town and they said, now, let's take their names and combine them, Waldon or Maybark, and name the jail. And they thought, well, that's not going to be too good for the community, so we won't do it. So they never did go ahead and name it that. Now we go, just a minute. Fire. This building was a TG&Y. It burned up. Remember? Yeah. This was originally Martin's. Over here was Thompson's Cafe. There was another cafe here. Har Brothers was one of the first ones to come into town with D.R. Thomas and buy John Floyd and build in the Har Brothers store here. John Salaska built the next building. Goldbergs from Kansas City came down and put in a dry goods store here where the State Farm is. And then Bauer Brothers formed the store here. Randy Livings thinks that there was a back room back here that was the post office by Bowers for a while rather than the cabin. I don't know. I just don't know. But when they bought that building, the Livings family, and they were working on it, they found a room that was different than the rest of the rooms. Like it may have been a post office, could have been, don't know. But in any event, Bowers was here. They owned these lots here. Then they also owned those lots that I told you about up there. In between is a two-story building, which Ray Bates built as the racket shop. And then right here was Stranahan and Lauder. And right here on the curb was our first gas station in Fairview, Oklahoma. This was a wooden sidewalk, and they buried a 55-gallon drum and then put a hand pump on it. So you could drive up here with your can and get you some gas and put it in one of your 9 cars without a muffler and quietly go down the street. Bowers, the city water was right out here in the middle of the street. It's just a dug well. And then they later bought a windmill and installed a windmill on it. But we had water around here, just like you know how out on the farm, the water will run over the tank and you'll have a puddle. Well, we had water right here. Bowers insisted on getting a water line, so they made him a water line out of wood. He had a wooden water line into the Bowers store. It was the first water system in Fairview right here. Right after statehood, you had electricity coming, and you had the need of water. You had sewer problems already. So you have those things that are foremost in the minds of the council. The railroad did what they could to help, and let's go forward now. We're going on down. So this block, of course the street wasn't here, but there was about 5 structures in here, wooden structures that we see in the Diamond Jubilee book that was from the original town site, and it's laying north and south. I don't care what Homer Deeper says. And the buildings were all moved someplace else. So we go on then down to the next, and on the right, the brick building George Keck built, it was not there, but right next to it was Osborne Garage. And then south of that, on the lot, this side of the street, was where G.W. Steckel built his skating rink. The skating rink was built for $300 as near as I can tell, and sat there for a number of years. 2 grades from the grade school had to come to school right here in this building right here. Osborne's shop was here, and then this building here. It later was bought by the church, Pentecostal church, the Pentecostal Holiness, I think. They took it on, and then later George bought that lot and built his house, and he used it as a shop. This lot right here is where our old Blue Front Hotel was set. Yeah. And Homer Deemer's boy would come over here with a little wagon that he paid a dime for and collect the dirty clothes from the guys staying in the boarding house to take to his mama over on 8th Street, and she did the washing. Because Homer Deemer was one of the guys that was moving the equipment out of the building up ahead and putting in new engines, and got a chunk of rock in his eye, and he got blinded, so he could not work. So Mama Deemer had to wash clothes. So Miles came and got the dirty clothes in his little wagon, took it to his mama, and she washed them, and then brought them back. This building is the second electric building. The first of them was built a half a mile east of Fairview. And I don't know why, except there was some property out there that was conducive to development, not for housing or anything, but for commerce, the water and electricity and things like that. It was conducive. They were talking about building a water line across the Cimarron River, which would go over more to the east. Ultimately, they bought the Hog Ranch, which is up more to the north, and came down to a southwesterly direction into Fairview with their water line. Had a terrible time doing that. Cleo just had a fit. This building then was later built in the 40s. I can remember as a kid coming down here, and there was a pen here on the south side that had deer in it. You come down, that was our zoo. Okay, straight ahead. My parking lot. It's Mexican parking lot.
Where did the railroad cross? Railroad used to go east across Maine.
All right. You could just stop right here. This is the Hobo Village. This creek right here is the Hobo Village. 1901, J.R. Haley and a guy by the name of Hinkle built the flour mill right here where the co-op is. The first 95 feet in front was known as the creamery lot. The back part was known as the mill lot. The railroad tracks ran on the west side out here. There was a spur that came right across here and over the street to over there where the Orient Lake is that we're going to see about. And the trains would go over to the Orient Lake to get water. There was also a pipeline which piped it to a 75-foot tank over by the roundhouse. So they had two sources of water. But in any event, the hobos were quite an interesting phenomenon of the railroad because they picked up on the travel arrangements of the railroad. I read in one treatise that they had a college that they would back. They had a newsletter. There were people that were just professional hobos that just did it to kind of intermingle with those that were homeless or in need and made a lifestyle out of it. The night marshal caught an 11-year and a 13-year-old kid, two kids out here, and had to take them back to Weatherford because there were those that would just run off and get on the railroad. But all along this creek here, there were dugouts, there were tent sites, there were little shanties, and it was a known stopping place for hobos on the Orient Railroad of convenience. Two things. The city didn't like it, and a lot of the people didn't like it. One of the things they did, they would go up to that electric building up there in the wintertime where it was warm and stay in the electric building, and they'd have to run them out because they were messy. And the other thing is, the city decided to get rid of them. They passed an ordinance forming a wood cutting committee. And anybody who was not employed had to cut wood. And the wood cutting committee would set the price they would get paid for cutting the wood. So they were going to come down and get all those hobos and round them up and cut wood for the wintertime. Well, they just took off. They just get on the train and leave. That didn't last at all. The flour mill was a very interesting development. Not associated with the railroad for any reason that I can tell, because there's nothing said about the railroad in the development of the flour mill. All you had was a coming of people with wheat on their mind, and there was no way to deal with flour, getting flour, unless you drove clear to Enid or clear to Alva. And these guys, and Tannehill from Rusk, And Henry Bauer put the financing together, and Haley and Hinkle got the mill built. It was a 3-story plus a basement flour mill right over there. One of the key features to it, they also added corn, so they made cornmeal. There is in the process something about doing this where water's involved, and the water drains off, and it drained over towards the hobo plant. The hobos had their own, and that may be where the first saloon was, I don't know, but there was corn water out there north of the flour mill. The stench got so bad that the mothers of Fairview complained, so they passed an ordinance that you have a open drainage, you can have hogs to eliminate the stench. So the flour mill brought hogs to town, and they put in the hog pens out here. And the next thing the ladies of town were griping about was the smell of the hogs. So they had to change, and they got financing to do the operation different. But in the mill, your top floor was your anti-dusting equipment, and then you had your sorting equipment, and then they had the flour mill down on the main floor, and the corn was down in the basement. And it was quite an operation. And they had 3 different names of flour that they sold out of this mill for a long time. I can remember as a kid, it was here for a long time. Now, in winding down, you take from the Hobo Village clear to Highway 60 was all shops of the Orient Railroad. Big buildings, little buildings, $200,000 at that time. $200,000. If you add up the cost of all of the buildings that was listed, Mark Stepston and Bill Cornelson went through and found records and compiled them and put them in our history book. If you add it all up, $200,000 was spent on all of those structures to go in. 140 men. Your roundhouse is down on the end, 10-stall roundhouse. Until that time, if you wanted to move an engine over 239,000 Brooks 280 engine, you did it with men with steel bars underneath the wheels. Lift, over, to turn around. This structure had a turntable. You could drive onto it, press a button, and the train would go around to stall number 10 or stall number 1. They had engines from the Missouri Pacific Railroad coming to be repaired. They had engines from Mexico. I skipped that part. Arthur Stillwell, when he first got his first clutch of money, he took off for Mexico and met the president of Mexico and arranged. Much of this work on the railing out here was done by Mexicans. They had crews, and they'd do a contract here and a contract there. Dick Shuey came to me. He said, "Jim, I got this book." He said, "My granddad's grocery store in Orienta." He kept track of all of his sales. He said, "There's all these Mexican names on here. What is that?" I said, "That was the crew that built the railroad bridge across the Cimarron River to Orienta. Was a Mexican crew that lived up there. There was another crew down here 4 miles south of town, living down there that Champ Paul used to talk about. But they were intermittent workers. These others were permanent type workers. And the buildings were utilized, and there was all kinds of machinery in them. 3:00 a.m. March the 10th. I got 3/3/10/10. 3 a.m. March the 10th, 1910. The bell rang on the engine parked out here on the other side of this building. A fire had started, just like yesterday at Jensen's. And it was so hot in there, he ran out because he couldn't get to the alarm, and he got the bell on the engine and rang it till he woke the guys up in the Bluefront Hotel. And then they scattered and went and got the firemen and they got the wagon. Everything burned up. March 10, 1910, except the roundhouse. Now, they came back and said, oh, that's all right, the equipment's still usable, we'll build it back. Arthur Stillwell just lied through his teeth to Fairview that he's still going to do everything to make this a division point, 10,000 population. Wichita, Kansas just very secretly just handed him some money under the table, and they got the division point. And in 1912, he came back and shut down everything. Now we go on. So 1912, all those people moved out. There were vacancies. We tapered off. We never got over 3,500 population. But we did have an experience that was worth. He was going to build 4 more railroads into Fairview. One of them from Rusk to Fairview, to the left. This on the left, no, yeah, down the corner. I'm sorry, Keith, I forgot this. From straight back in here. This was Orient Lake, which was nothing but a pond. A pond that was built from the roundhouse, which sat right over there to the west. And you see the low area in there. It must have been built before 1901 because it's depicted on the plat map down here in the corner. And it was nothing but a shallow pond that was for water for the steam engines. And after this fire of 1910 and the closing down of everything in 1912, it sat here. Boy, it was a good swimming hole and a fishing hole. People like to come down and park. The only thing about it, people come down and picnicking and parking. Said, there's a boy skinny dipping out there. That's not nice. So the city said in 1920 to the railroad, drain that pond. And going through the red tape, it took them 2 years to get that pond drained. And they finally did, and they sold that tract of land there for $5,800. We go on now and turn left at the rodeo grounds. Yeah, I get that from Miles Deemer in his journal that they came down here skinny dipping, and the people complained about it.
What was the population of Fairview in 1910 before the fire? Approximately.
Around 2,500.
They left the railroad track till the late 40s.
Oh yeah, the track was yeah.
Crossing Maine. Yeah.
That contract they made with that guy back east was in the 50s.
Yeah. This used to be a go-kart track. Where the rodeo grounds is.
Now, right past the fence, stop. Past the fence. Then we'll turn right. See if you stop here, then you can go ahead and make a turn. The dam for the lake ran from the corner of the rodeo grounds over to Bob Horner's house there to the northwest. That was the dam. And all they did was just knock that dirt out and drain it out. They didn't take anything at all. Okay. Turn right. So, what we had then was all this park area, and in 1908, a bunch of guys got together and said, let's have a fair. There was no money for the fair. They formed a corporation. They sold shares of stock. The corporation stocked a county fair in the fall of 1908. And they built a half-mile track out here by scraping it off with one of those drays. And they brought in horse racing. They had trotters, pacers, and runners. In 1908, they had 2 days of horse racing. The county fair was just laid out in the open over here. But it was a success, a financial success, to bring in those horse people. One of the city council members loved horses, So he was interested in pursuing that. And I'm telling you, the Fairview Republican in December of 1908, talking about the county fair, all they did was post the results of the horse races. But they went back to the city council, and the council gave them $500 to put together a legitimate county fair. And so the first real good county fair was 1909. And Dana Baldwin went through the records, and all she could find was back to about 1930. But this is in the Republican that they did that, and each and every year then they featured these horse racing events as part of the county fair. But they built on that. Now in the 20s, along about World War I, which Arthur Stillwell predicted would happen in one of his books. Crazy guy. They quit the horse racing so much. It did re-establish in 1938. A horse racing commission was appointed by the city council, and they came back, and then right about well, it was right after the war, we put a stadium right here, a seating right here. And then after that, they began inviting horse racers from different states. Kansas, New Mexico, Texas had horses coming in here. One guy, before he left, said, "This is the greatest race meet I've been to in all 3 states." And then, of course, it expanded, and they put the stalls over there to the west where the rodeo ground is. Now, in time, then, that phased out. Those guys got out of the picture. But some of your local men got together and with their cars came out and utilized the area for racing cars. So we had car racing with a half-mile track. Then we modified and we had a quarter-mile track. Then we had the go track. And now this was our high school racetrack. The half-mile track is what I ran on in high school in 1946 to 1948. And when I'd go to a state meet and it was a quarter, I didn't know how to run because I wasn't through running yet. When I got to the end, I still had another quarter mile I wanted to go. But in any event, it ran all the way over to the alley of 13th Street, a half a mile in there. But it was also utilized for our football grounds. And of course, we have had developments of our swimming pool and our fair buildings, as you all know about, modern stuff. And so this has really been a complex that's proved to be a benefit to Fairview. And that just about concludes the presentation, other than to tell you about Connie Lapierre's backyard.
Which way you want me to go?
Any way you want to go, get back to the hospital. We're going around here, and then go left. Go around, go left. Back up to our street.
The original swimming pool was north of that one.
Yes, the original swimming pool is up there by Park Avenue and where that street comes in, where they put the railroad engine where the water was. I used to swim there.
It was deep.
Yes.
Where'd you live on the west side?
You know where the slaughter, the meat processing on the west side, and in the north they have a block. There's a cement block house right there west.
Yeah.
That's the Montgomery house. The Montgomery families built that,
Okay.
and we were half a block north.
Okay.
I call this Connie Lapierre's backyard. This was a city dump. This was a city dump until 1912. This is where people brought all of their garbage. We had 2 men that we paid, we call scavengers. And they would go around and pick up anything and bring it over here. That's why it's elevated as well as it is. They have full of dirt over the top of it. But of course, that's where the city dump was, right there. And then when they banned it in the city limits, they got this little place down on the curve south of town where our pig barn is. That is our first big city dump. Any more questions? You guys have been pretty attentive. Yeah, W.C. Edwards bought this half section. It's a record. It's on one of the maps. And that one north of town, I don't know whether Wayman bought it from him or not, but he was so bent on locking in the real estate in this town that he went ahead and bought it. Of course, he had money by then. He'd been in the Senate, running for governor. Arthur Stillwell had a wonderful life. Built houses, he built railroads, he built parks. He only has one monument in his name. He died at the age of 68 years. He had $1,000 in his bank account. His wife, he and his wife had no children, but they lived in a New York apartment. 2 weeks after he died and was cremated, she jumped out the window. William Edwards died at 68. After all he'd done, and came back to be postmaster in 1922, got this building house for the post office for his wife's building for the post office where the Eagle is. He went home and died. All of that, 68's not very old. Think what they could have done if they could have lived to be our age.